dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. I'm Claire, and I'm here with my co host Marsha, and this week we're going to be talking about The Society, which is a one season of a show on Netflix, which I think is really interesting. But Marsha is going to outline to you why it is also annoying. Would you like to do that now?
Yes, it's a show that's sort of a bit of drama, thriller, on Netflix. I think it was released 2019. And the story revolves around a group of teenagers from the town of West Ham in America, and they go on this field trip basically on a bunch of buses. They leave their hometown, but due to a storm, they have to turn back and come back home. But when they arrive, something's different. And all of the adults in their town have disappeared, which leaves the teenagers to sort of fend for themselves a bit. And yeah, I think as they sort of explore, the whole entire town is cut off from the rest of the world, and none of the geography that was there before was there, so they are completely on their own. And it's sort of the show explores the sort of establishing of order and how these teenagers try to establish a government and survive in this like new reality, and the sort of conflicts and power struggles that happen.
Yeah, we were comparing this to sort of stories like sort of the Lord of the Flies type premise, where they're stuck
Yes.
on an island, or kind of, some sort of post-apocalyptic existence
Yeah.
where only the young survive. But I guess what's different about this is that they've got a town with full amenities to some extent. They've still got power,
Yes.
they've still got water, they've still got a closed phone network within their group. But that's it. So it's not quite the sort
Yeah.
of same fight for survival. It's more like if
Yeah.
you were stuck in
It's
your town, small
yeah.
town America kind of thing, how would this work?
Yeah. I think we were just sort of discussing a couple of the plot holes really about how, you know, where exactly like, where are they sort of getting this signal from? They're able to text each other within this town, and
Mm,
that's sort of their, ability to communicate, and they still get a water supply, an electricity
mm.
supply, the sewage, like what is going on? I think they sort of bring in a bit of a supernatural aspect into the show about how they sort of arrived in this altered reality, and sort of talking about
Mm.
parallel universes and
Mm.
stuff, because obviously all of these things have changed and you can't really just replicate a whole
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like the
entity.
forest has sprung up as though it's kind of always
Yeah,
been there on the roads, and there's the solar eclipse that
yeah, there's a
wasn't
whole entire
scheduled,
solar
and so
eclipse.
on.
Yeah,
Uh, so yeah, I mean, all
yeah,
of that is sort of slightly unsatisfying, especially because it's completely unresolved.
it culminates to nothing.
Yeah, all we have at the end is that like Peter
Yes.
Pan reference, the idea that of Wendy and the Darlings coming back home,
Mhm.
and that being kind of read, and there's just a board of names of missing kids, but we don't get anything satisfactory, and it would
Yeah,
appear we never will, because there is now not going to be a season two, so we're
yeah,
left
I know.
wondering about this.
Although, however, I have heard there's a graphic novel in the making, but I think
Good
that's
to
probably
hear. Well, I'm glad
no.
somebody will try and sort
Yeah.
of give us a bit of a
Yes.
lead on where we think this is going.
I mean, it'd definitely be interesting to sort of find out what happens, but in terms of its exploration of a dystopia, I think it's a pretty good
It
sort of
is. It sort of does something I think that not many other things do, because it is this kind of starting from scratch, but not just sort of living in the woods or whatever. It's actually these people who are. It's a bit of a coming of age thing, because these are sort of people on the point of graduating high school for the most
Mhm.
part. The sort of upper years of American high school.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of them having to grow up and be adults, but also the idea of them basically being stuck with the same people that they've lived
Mm.
with like their whole entire lives.
Yes.
So, I mean, one of the things that obviously we see is over the course of 10 episodes, we see the kind of like point of realization that something is wrong through to
Hmm.
the sort of realizing that actually there's only so much food available, and the idea that they actually have to have a sort of sustainable existence. So there's kind of that's the sort of narrative trajectory, I suppose, of the whole thing. But essentially the first thing that happens is they all have a massive party.
Yeah, that's it.
Everybody
Very
gets sort of drunk and
teenagers
stoned and
accurate.
like
Yeah.
passes out in the church and
Yeah.
stuff.
Love. Yeah, yeah.
Um, so realistic response to
Yeah, no, I'd say no
yeah,
parental supervision, going
yeah,
wild.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
mm,
it's sort of, I guess, the aftermath of that, where everyone sort of it sets in that no one's coming to get them, and that
mm,
their parents aren't coming back.
mm.
That is, yeah, it's just sort of,
That penny for me doesn't drop
Mhm.
until Emily dies
Oh
in the
yeah,
woods. I think
yeah,
that's the moment. So they set out on an expedition to try and see what's in or beyond these woods. And one of the girls in the group is bitten by a snake, has an allergic
Mhm.
reaction, goes into anaphylactic shock and dies.
Yeah,
And there's nothing that anyone can do about it. And I don't think anyone could necessarily have done very much about it, even
no,
in
not
the
at all.
normal world, but definitely not in this world where there's no one to call for help.
Yeah, they don't have,
Um,
medics,
mm,
don't have like a constant sort of, I don't know what happens when, I don't know, I don't know, it's a very cool concept. There's a lot to think about, but yeah, there's quite a lot of deaths in it, funnily enough, and it's
yeah,
sort of permanent thing because I feel like at first all these teenagers are like, oh, it's a bit of a maybe a bit of a prank, and everyone's
mm,
sort of left, um and I guess it sort of puts into question of if these teens do eventually get back to the real world, that
mm,
this sort of event has a sort of ongoing effect on everyone. Because I mean,
yeah.
there's probably a lot of trauma that's developed, but
Mm.
um I mean, should we talk a bit about how leadership is established and what?
Absolutely, yeah, because I think from that sort of turning point, they've
Mm,
been sort of messing around with sort of, who's telling who to do what
yes.
and so on. But um, one of the things I suppose that happens is because they've all been in high school together,
Hmm.
then, they've got a kind of a social hierarchy
Yes, there's a
and a
bit of
sort
a,
of
yeah,
school kind of, this is the person who's on this committee, or
yeah,
did
lots of like pre-established cliques, you could say.
yeah, exactly. And some of that sort of like holds on,
Hmm.
like in terms of leadership, and some of it no longer has any value,
Yeah, yeah.
in
I mean,
terms of status.
it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess well, in terms of sort of illustrating that. Well, obviously Cassandra, who's like one of the main characters, and the sister of Ali, um, sort of takes the main lead the first couple
Mm,
of episodes, but that also comes from the like fact that I think she was a prefect in her school.
yeah,
So
whatever
then,
they have in America, but
yeah,
yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever it is,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the sort of there's a sort of established police sort of policing group called the Guard, which are like sort of consist of these jocks, I guess. But then obviously when it comes to there's a character called Harry who, was sort of bit of a king of the school. But I think that came from a lot to do with his wealth. And that his whole entire role sort of breaks down when, money is made redundant because
Yeah, there's that moment, isn't there, where he's
yeah,
pulling gold bars out of
well,
the safe, and
yeah,
his
crazy.
girlfriend's like,
That
it's
doesn't mean
just a bit
anything
of
now.
metal,
That's a bit of metal.
Um, so yeah, absolutely. And Harry, I think, I mean, he's actually, I think, like a complex character, but certainly a very
Mm,
good example of somebody who's kind of, as you say, been right at the top.
yeah,
I mean, you've got kind of those sort of standard sort of American high school movie sort of roles, as you say.
yeah,
You've got Luke the quarterback, and his mates, and they form the guard, and then you've got
yeah,
Harry, who's the sort of rich, pretty one, who's kind of
yes,
with the big house and the Maserati and the Porsche
yeah,
and so on.
yeah, yeah, and the
Um,
girlfriend, etc.
yeah, but basically nothing else going for him. I mean, that's he feels that he is owed something,
Hmm.
but none of that really matters.
Yeah, yeah. And
Um,
I think yeah, there's sort of a sort of big narrative around like their privilege is sort of,
mm,
these like middle class. I think West Ham's meant to be a very like affluent town,
yeah,
where, a lot of the people are very wealthy, but
mm,
suddenly now they have to, clean and, you know,
mm,
ration food, and it's kind
mm.
of, yeah, it's very much suddenly become this sort of socialist, society for them.
Yeah,
And you
absolutely.
can't really take like everything you want, and there is no sort of ownership because, there are limited resources, and
Mm.
there's not a world, as far as they know, beyond what they have. Um,
It was interesting for me kind of rewatching that it actually sort of takes them quite a bit longer
yeah.
to realize, like in my memory, because I suppose the actual sort of focus points of the show are sort of on the sort of critical moments, but
Mhm.
actually when it tells you kind of like how much time has passed and things like that, it takes them quite a long time to
Yeah.
realize that they have to form some sort of order. And Cassandra, I suppose, whether she was leader of the school council and so on, she's obviously got that
Mhm.
sort of slightly sort of natural leader, but also
Mhm.
seen as a bit of a busybody, seen as sort of entitled in her role of leadership.
Yeah.
But she actually kind of like everyone might be saying, oh, why should we do what you say? But ultimately, she's the one who kind of manages to convince people.
Yeah. And she sort of steps up to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's the one who sets up the work rotas and gets everybody to agree that what they
Mhm.
that in order to conserve food they can't just go taking it. There's, I mean, actually really disturbing scenes, to be honest, of like people sort of like supermarket sweep sort of on the shelves and just like
Yeah. Definitely
wrestling
sort of.
each other for like their favorite crap foods or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, definitely sort of
um
reminiscent of that time in COVID when everyone
yeah,
was sort of piling on like toilet
yeah,
paper
exactly,
or whatever.
exactly. There's that bit, isn't there, where there's a boy taking a whole load of like snacks from the deli and is like way more than he could like eat himself, but just I want them so that other people don't get them. um
Yeah.
and there's a bit, isn't there, with Ali talking to Elle. So Ali
Yes.
is the younger sister of Cassandra, the one who's always been in her shadow, but she'll become a central character, um, which we'll discuss in a moment. And Elle, who is she's the outsider. She's generally been unlikable. She's a
Yeah.
sort of ballet
I think,
dancer.
yeah. Well, I guess she's almost just been sort of shunted as this sort of quiet archetype, which I don't think she's necessarily. I think, yeah, she seems like a quite a complicated character because she never really comes into her own. Like she,
No, I mean she's treated like she's a complete bitch, but we're not
yeah,
actually shown that it's not just that she just doesn't quite fit, I suppose, and
yeah,
comes across a certain way, but she doesn't help herself by taking like bags and bags of the same foods from the supermarket. And
yeah.
Ali says to her, talks about this film, talks about it with the idea that a capsizing ship, the captain tells everybody to stay in the ballroom, and they do and drown, except for the few who decide that they're going to, make their way up to the top or, as it were, bottom of the
Mhm.
ship. And she's sort of saying, who are you in this story? And that I think is quite a question that comes up throughout the whole thing, like who are you
Yeah.
going to be in this story? And to start with, Ali kind of is really in her sister's shadow. Her sister won't put her
Mhm.
on the committee that they form. Her sister, to be fair, Cassandra like really rallies people to actually do things that they don't want to do
Yes.
when she sets up work rotas. And she says, we're going to lock the food down and going to do communal eating in the cafeteria. She
Mhm.
manages to get a universal decision on that.
Yes. Yes, she does.
So that's quite a positive step. And it does feel for a bit like they've kind of got an idea on sort of that this sort of form of socialism, which reminded me a lot of The Last of Us and the idea of kind of the communist community there. This
Yeah.
idea that with small scale you can do communal living. Um,
Yes.
but the problem is that sharing things does not come easily to those who have had more.
Hmm.
And they decide to share houses.
Yes.
Um, I mean, what did you think about that decision? Because they basically set it up so that like everyone's sharing the big houses and they're like four or five to a bedroom, unless you're a couple, in which case you have your own room.
Well, I think it's a smart idea in terms of, I think the sort of initiative behind that was to save, electricity and sort
Mm,
of account for any shortages in supplies or
mm,
resources that they may encounter in the future. I mean, I'm not sure like exactly about the couple thing. I guess it makes sense in kind of having a bit more privacy. I mean, I think what's interesting to me is how Campbell and Elle, who so
mm,
Campbell's this character who is a cousin of Cassandra and Ali, and who is said to be a bit of a psychopath, and
mm.
he like Elle enters a very toxic relationship with
Yeah.
him, where he manipulates the people around him, and
Mm.
he only really cares about himself, but they get a whole entire house to themselves.
This is because they're sort of said that, Campbell would just infect things. But of course, you're right, as a consequence,
Mhm.
it allows the abuse that Elle experiences to come to pass in a way that probably wouldn't have happened if they'd been part of the
Yes.
community. So I think it
Yeah.
exemplifies something perhaps important.
Whilst I think it is, in terms of a long run survival situation is the best idea,
Mm,
but maybe um, sort of considering when people need individual space is quite
mm.
important, and where those sort of spaces can be created. Because obviously I
Yeah.
think there's a bit of an issue within sort of the mental health
Mm,
area. And like I guess that's not really, I think Harry becomes a bit of this sort of character who develops depression, which I'm
mm.
surprised many other characters aren't really mentioned to have that. But
Yeah.
I think it would have been interesting to see how the show would have explored that further, and
Mm.
how like what sort of precautions could be taken. I guess you can't really have teenagers becoming therapists in the same way that the
No,
characters
I
body in.
yeah, there is a real issue with that sort of discussion of
Mm.
mental health, I felt, because
Mhm.
you're right. I mean, I suppose you've got a lot of people who would be unhappy because their situation is an unhappy situation, but there
Yeah.
is something also about the way they form community to kind of help each other kind of get through that. And that's sort of a
Mhm.
positive thing about
Oh
the
yeah.
nobody becoming isolated and so on. And even like with the work rotas, yeah, okay, everyone hates the fact that they're having to do manual labor, and there's such a feeling that, oh,
Mm.
we know these jobs have to be done, but we shouldn't be the sort of people who are having to do them, even though,
Mm.
you know, one of the things I wondered about really was whether the house sharing, and as you say, the sort of cramped
Mm.
existence, so is the push too far. There's pros and cons, aren't there? But when people do start to dissent, it
Mhm.
could be a sort of way of maybe taking a bit of pressure off some of that existence,
Yeah,
um, having a
yeah.
bit of space to yourself.
There's also the sort of other side of that where, for example, Will's character,
Mm,
doesn't come from a place of money, or, I think he's an orphan and is
mm,
fostered among many different homes, and he talks a lot about sort of how he's had to survive on his own, whilst everyone else has, grown up in a very privileged lifestyle. And for
mm,
him, this, this event has made his style of living almost better. Um,
yeah.
which, yeah, I guess, there's sort of two sides to it.
One of the things I thought we might pick up on at this point is just a little bit more about what you were saying about mental health, perhaps,
Hmm.
before we move on, just because I think that they focus on Harry from that perspective.
Yes.
And, on the one hand, Harry is highly unsympathetic in many ways.
Yeah.
He is this terribly privileged
Hmm.
young man who treats his girlfriend very badly,
Yes.
who generally is very disparaging about women and about Cassandra, and who ends up being really quite pathetic once his sort of status is stripped away.
Yeah.
At the same time, we also learn that he's dealing a lot with the loss of his father, the discovery that his mother was having an affair,
In fact.
and also develops a a drug habit. So when we
Yeah.
see him enter into this depression that is so bad that he can't get out of bed, it's difficult to sort of entirely, I guess,
Mm.
say he's not responsible for it, because he's the one who, I suppose, instantly turns to the drugs that he then can't kick. But it is
Yeah.
tough to watch in a way, because
Mm.
when that you've got, basically, if you don't work, then you don't eat, or your rations are docked if you don't work.
Yeah.
Physical
Uh,
health seems to be accommodated. There's a girl who
yes.
has like a cold or whatever, and is evidently ill, and that's fine. But then that mental health isn't. Although,
Hmm.
as you say, if everybody's basically in a bad place, you just have to put the benchmark somewhere really different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, how much of Harry's mental health do you think is derivative of his drug habit? Because
It's really hard to tell, isn't it?
I think it's interesting where so Campbell is the supplier of these
Mm,
drugs to Harry. A, where is he sourcing
mm.
these from? Because I think they're in this situation for definitely a couple months. Oh well, like at least a third of a year. I think over like 160
Yeah, yeah.
days,
I
I
mean
think.
it.
And there's a sort of pharmacy and stuff. But again, I think it's one of those things that isn't necessarily open to the public to just go and take things.
Yeah,
So
again, that's not really very clear, is it? Because they sort of Cassandra needs her heart medication,
yes,
and we sort of see them trying to break in. And I think we can only assume that basically they do
yeah,
eventually manage to access all the pharmaceuticals, and presumably Campbell nicks whatever it is. We don't ever learn
mm,
what it is that he's um, giving to Harry as a kind of pick
yeah,
me up. But he's basically controlling that supply, and whether that's because he is the sort of pre-existing drug dealer among them, which I
hmm,
think is quite likely, or whether it's because he actually does have a long game in terms of manipulating Harry. I'm
yeah.
not sure we ever quite know. But yeah, I thought that it was interesting that they sort of handle a bit about being physically ill. They have a
Yes.
wheelchair user among the
Do they?
kids. Yes, there is a wheelchair user, but nothing is ever covered about how
No,
they do or
that's
don't
cool.
accommodate that person's needs.
Yeah.
Though I think good representation on how to be good friends with a deaf person, because
Yes.
actually I think the way in which ASL and English are kind of incorporated into the show consistently,
Yes.
for communicating with Sam, actually just not really made a big thing of, but just
Hmm. It just sort of exists, and yeah, it's good. And I think also the development of Grizz's and Sam's sort of relationship is really sweet.
yeah.
I mean, I think a bit of like the commentary on like queerness
Mhm.
that Sam experiences, and almost his like isolation because he thinks he's
Yeah.
really the only person out there who,
Yeah, like actually the only gay in the village kind of situation,
yeah, that's it.
and also I think something on that sort of toxicity that Grizz intended to come out when he went to college. He wanted to
Mm,
get away, and I think he says at one point, doesn't he, at prom, I think, that
yeah.
he basically never intended to be in touch with any of his high
Yeah.
school friends again, because obviously they've got this toxic masculine culture,
Hmm.
and then he's stuck with them. And Sam, in turn, in a very complex situation, because he stays loyal to Becca, pretending to be the
Yes.
father of Becca's baby.
I think it's an interesting decision for Sam. I mean, this is less about the
Mm,
dystopian, me just generally like
yeah.
considering character motivations,
Mm.
but why Sam didn't sort of just confess to Grizz alone that he was.
Yeah, and I think it is through loyalty to Becca, because she's got such a,
Yeah.
a big hang up about it. But
Yes.
talking about kind of like the dystopian element, I think that there is something here about all of those. When you can't make a fresh start, they've got this opportunity to make a completely new society, to do
Mm,
something different where they treat each other better and so on. You
yeah.
can't get rid of those kind of hang-ups that
Yeah.
pre-exist, whether it be the homophobia, or whether it be the
Mm,
stigma attached to
yeah.
having a baby after a one-night stand, the huge issue of the loss of choice. It would
Yeah.
appear that, without any way to have a safe termination.
Mm.
At least that's what we're sort of led to believe. That Becca is basically lumbered with this pregnancy.
Yeah.
So there are things there that I think definitely make this a much worse place to exist, but also just equally as bad as life in small town America was before.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a little bit about kind of Cassandra as a character, and Harry as a character. So Harry, previous top dog, now reduced to this kind of depressed drug addict. Cassandra with a good group of people around her, but very much a kind of clearly in control and not necessarily very popular for that, but making good decisions. But Cassandra gets shot.
Yes.
We have essentially a sort of an assassination of the leader, effectively, with all the destabilization that causes, and a subsequent attempt at as kind of forensic an investigation as can be done with no expertise and so on, and a trial and a conviction, trial by jury and a sentencing by Ali, who basically steps into the shoes of her sister with the support of the others. Essentially, I think, I mean, you were questioning it a bit, but I think the idea is that it's about continuity, isn't it? She's basically saying, these are Cassandra's rules. I'm not doing anything new. Of course, she does do new things, but to start with, I'm just enforcing what my sister did.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how Ali inherits, well, we were sort of saying how she just inherits Cassandra's role based off the fact that they are sisters, and that sort of, there is a bit of involvement from other people. I think there was a pre-established committee that Cassandra had sort of set up,
that's right.
they decided that Ali was the best person for the job. But I think, I don't know, I think that's just a sort of weird place to base things off, because I don't think just because, as a, symbolism of Ali being Cassandra's sister and therefore the sort of rightful inheritors like this leadership role, that Ali necessarily has the skill set to lead.
It's very Children of Men, isn't it?
Yeah.
The cousin picking up the old coronation ring.
Yes.
I think that one of the positives, though, and perhaps something that is one of the reasons, is that Ali really doesn't want to be leader.
No.
Cassandra, I think, naturally did kind of want that and stepped into that role and so on. Ali doesn't want it, and in some senses, many people might say, well, that's actually what makes her good at it. She kind of does it out of a sense of duty, of the request of others, and so on. She changes in that, obviously, and she discusses that quite a bit. But one of the things that obviously happens is we really get an insight into the weight of this job as it weighs down on her.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is particularly complex is this idea about how to maintain the rule of law when you have no legal system per se.
Yeah, a little bit like, well, she has to sort of become a bit iron-fisted, I would say, especially in relation to, so as the plot sort of progresses, they track down who the murderer of Cassandra was, through the confession of a boy called Dewey to Harry. And this is sort of all in relation to, I mean, as you were saying, these sort of pre-established sort of beliefs, homophobia and kind of misogynism.
Yeah, that really big misogynistic rant by the pool, isn't there? Yeah.
And I guess Dewey could fall into that sort of archetype of a bit of like an incel.
Yeah, I thought that as well. When he actually says, why, whatever he says about her being
sort of,
a
she
cunt
had
or
it
whatever,
coming or something, whatever, or sort of, uses terminology such as like
and
bitch.
the bitches who are like, controlling us and so on. It has that very strong flavour of that, doesn't it? And he is, he's a little bit of a sort of weaselly little loser that nobody really noticed, and everyone's really quite surprised because they thought it would be somebody, one of the kind of major characters.
And it's very sort of, considering that they're all teenagers in the final year of secondary school, sort of, I guess, school shootery kind of vibe. I don't know.
Didn't you find, I still can't get over it, that thing that like every time a gun sounds, they all like drop.
Get on the floor. Yeah, in the cafeteria.
We know that is literally
Yeah,
they're
it's
trained in
ingrained.
that,
Yeah.
and it just comes up over and over in the show. We forget how different that is from
Yeah, that's not something we really
British
experience in the
culture.
UK.
No, but yeah, I mean, so with Dewey, I think that there's something quite admirable about the community when they endeavour to hold a fair trial.
Yeah, and Ali really pushes for that.
She does, that Helena, much against her will, has to represent, and does represent,
Yeah,
does make a sort of real effort, I think, to represent Dewey,
yeah.
with Gordy kind of acting for the prosecution with the sort of gun evidence, such as it
Mm.
is.
Well, I think this is also sort of I mean in terms of Helena and Ali and their trial, I think this is where
Mm.
Ali sort of first has a bit of a turn where she does almost fall into that manipulative role of a leader, where
Mm.
she sort of says to Helena, "Oh, whatever happens to him is as much in your head,
Yeah,
like whether you
yeah,
decide to do it or not."
yeah.
And because she asks, because since Dewey needs a lawyer, a
Mm.
representative, she asks Helena to step into that role, though she does
Mm.
not want to.
I suppose again, there's that feeling that it has to be somebody who is, I guess, sufficiently smart and sufficiently au fait with, debating and things like that, to be able to stand up to Gordy, who is obviously also one of the sort of most
Yeah.
academic of the students. So,
Mm.
it does make sense. But you're right, there is something quite tough about it. But I suppose it's the same in a way as sort of making people essentially do jury service and things. It's sort of
Yeah.
saying, they have a civic responsibility. And so many dystopian sort of situations with kind of even a temporary authoritarian leader, the way that you might say that Ali is, because she's sort of governing by general consent, but not by election. We often sort of see this assumption that kind of the trial by jury will fall away, and there's quite a lot of discussion about how that's sort of maintained, the idea that you have to arrest somebody with a charge, with evidence. You can't hold them otherwise. There's a sort of, quite a like inherent sense of justice among this sort of group of kids, which is something I would hope,
Mhm.
education does do for people of that age.
Yeah.
I mean, Dewey obviously does confess to the court in the end. He's already been
Yeah.
found guilty by that point, by this jury of his peers. And then Ali spends 3 days, I think, contemplating
Yes.
what she is going to do, during which time they are using a wine cellar as a prison cell, which is
Mm.
obviously, it's not ideal because it has no toilet facilities, it has glass doors and things like that. It's not terrible, but it's not great. But
Mhm.
it does give us one of the examples of when the guard start to manipulate their power,
Power.
because it's
Yeah.
Clark, isn't it, who beats Dewey up. Now that comes up in the trial, but isn't really given very much due consideration.
Yeah. I mean, again, sort of comes up with Lexi's
It
interrogation,
does, yeah.
where it's this sort of abuse of power and
Mm.
really how in this sort of society do you control the sort of police. Well, Alexei accuses Ali of sort of creating this police state, whereas, but it consists of five men who,
That I think is one problem, is that
yeah.
it is an all male police force, which in the
Mhm.
circumstances, when Lexi gets her period and they make her change in front of
Yeah.
them, it's pure abuse of
Mhm.
power and trying to intimidate. Likewise with Dewey's beaten up, the fact that there's no one else
Mhm.
there to basically stop Clark
Top
doing
Clark,
what
yeah.
he's doing. One of the things I definitely think happens is that that Ali doesn't keep a close enough control on
Yeah.
the guard.
I mean, I guess how would she really do that? I mean, because I think Lexi sort of comes up to Ali afterwards saying, "This is what's happened to me. What are you going to do
Mm,
about it?" And
yeah.
Ali sort of dismisses her, saying, "Oh, there are people out here who are getting sick, etc.,
Mm,
etc." And sort of dismisses
mm,
not Ali's, Lexi's
mm,
experiences.
mm,
But I guess what is she really meant to do? Because she's sort of like, "Oh, we're going to train up more people to join the
yeah.
guard,
I mean,
sort of spread out our forces." But
what can you ever do? I mean, I suppose it
yeah,
raises a question, isn't it? If you're going to have a police force, and we know, I mean, in America, but also very much in this country, a real difficulty in enforcing standards among the police, because you're giving people power, which then they seem more liable to abuse, whether that's with respect to the shooting of suspects in the States, the abuse of prisoners, as we see in this show, or the sort of sexual power that police officers often seem to wield over victims as well. I mean, there's all sorts there, isn't there, about the sort of the arguments behind defund the police and the racial issues in America, and perhaps in this country particularly. I mean, as well as the racism, we have these issues of misogyny among the police force.
Yeah.
So I suppose you have to have robust systems, essentially, of being able to remove your police officers if they don't follow a certain code, that, if they commit a criminal act. I suppose the problem is the fact that Ali has got very limited choices around her, but it does backfire. Eventually it's the guard who lead. Well, they don't lead. They think they're leading, I think, a coup against her. So this is an issue. But perhaps before we come on to that, we should talk about what happens to Dewey. So after her deliberations, Ali decides that, strongly encouraged by those around her, that there is no alternative but to execute Dewey.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is the big sort of issue within, well, not issue, but what, the weight that Ali carries as a leader. She sort of talks about how even though there are other people who she discusses her decisions with, at the end of the day, she's responsible for what happens and what takes place, and that's how the rest of the society that they live in will see it. But so she decides that the death sentence is what is correct for Dewey, and that's what his sentence will be. And I think we're talking about how really quite powerful that scene is. I guess it's different when the death sentence is given in the real world compared to now, because they talk about how all of them have grown up with Dewey and how he was in their statistics classes, or they'd known him as a kid and now they're executing him. But there's also on the other side of that, how come Dewey didn't have that sort of same
Cassandra
I
mean, we're sort of given the impression that he kind of acted because Harry said, made allusions to killing Cassandra. But I mean, as you say, I don't think we're told whether they are, obviously we're not told what state they're based in, this town, but so we don't know whether that state has the death penalty, but obviously they're in a country where a number of states have the death penalty. And so in that sense, I suppose it's a little bit more close to home perhaps than it would be for a UK audience, because obviously it's such a long time since we've had the death penalty in this country, or certainly that the death penalty has been applied in this country. But I suppose we're also made to think, well, this is a different sort of situation, isn't it? What else can they do? They have no prison facility. Not quite sure why they don't have a prison facility. Do they find a police car, but I'm guessing they don't have a police station. We're never told that there's
I'm not really
cells
sure.
or whatever.
I mean, what but also it's the sort of resources spent into guarding those prisoners. I guess I don't know. That's
absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of the issue. And then, I mean, I think I would be tempted to sort of exile him, but their point is, well, they haven't got the resources to defend their borders either. So it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, as somebody who's deeply against the death penalty, but when you're presented with this sort of scenario, it's easy to see, and they discuss this at length, don't they? Helena, weird kind of character, the kind of Christian preacher on the one hand, no sex before marriage or engagement anyway, and all the sort of thing, and knowing her Bible and so on. But then the other side where she's like, I'm keeping my gun, and then she's anti-death penalty. Very odd. Very typical kind of certain American view, I think. But I mean, the actual, of course, killing of Dewey is made really difficult for the viewer, because they put this sort of system in place where 2 of the guns contain blanks and only one of them has real bullets in, so they won't know which of the 3 of them, which of the 3 of the guard actually killed Dewey.
Ever confirmed who killed? Because
no, it's not. But of course, they all think that they did.
All think they did.
I definitely didn't have blanks in my gun, so it has a really bad impact on the executioners. Grizz can't even go through with it, or he fires the first time, they all miss. Dewey's still alive, and then Ali has to step in and do it herself, which you might say she should perhaps have done anyway, rather than putting it on somebody else. But yeah, I don't know. It's horrible, really horrible. I mean, he does actually have quite a clean death once they finally get as far as killing him, but there's no reason why that should actually happen, since they're blatantly all terrible shots.
Yes.
So,
Easy. Yeah, they were standing really far away. I was just like, it's quite impressive if you do hit them, to be honest, at the end of the day. Because all of them like, oh, we don't know how to use a gun. We don't know how to use a gun.
Yeah, and of course, the person who does know how to use a gun there is Helena, and she won't do it because she doesn't agree with what they do, and also because she's acting as this kind of chaplain role as well.
I think and then the sort of, again, coming back to the mental health consequences does have quite an impact on the executioners. I mean, like, what's interesting to me is that no one thinks about sort of taking their own life, and I know that's a very sort of dark.
But you are right that again it fits in. Although again, I suppose that there is something that, although it's never explicit, there is something deliberately perhaps in place in terms of community by being in each other's pockets and so on. Perhaps that acts as a bit of a preventative. But yes, I think that the only person who alludes to it is perhaps Elle, in her situation of domestic abuse, after she manages to poison everybody with antifreeze, and a greatly exciting, oh no, where is the pumpkin pie that's going to kill everybody scene. And again, had Elle successfully killed Campbell,
then what would
have happened exactly? I mean, she has these evident mitigating circumstances. He tries to drown her. She's covered in cigarette burns and so on. He kills the dog.
No, but again, also dog turns up in this, like,
dog turns up in the so maybe he doesn't kill the dog, or maybe it goes through, or maybe there are parallel dogs. Fair point. Yeah, we're never told for definite that he kills the dog. We're just given that strong impression, aren't we? So yeah, and again, that's an interesting one, because Campbell does all these things. He is not arrested for domestic abuse. When he is arrested, it's because Dewey implicates him, but there's no evidence. And Sam is particularly, along with some of the others, say that because he is a known psychopath who has these kind of behavioural issues from the past, he should be confined. But Ali says, he hasn't committed a crime.
There's no evidence against him, which I think is fair, but obviously it sort of comes back to explode in their face later on. But you can't really confine someone without them having committed a crime. But that's the thing, I guess, with the whole entire Elle situation. Is like, why didn't they send the guard after him? I think even though Ali was sort of, was a better leader in some aspects than others, I think she did the right thing by, I guess, also sort of respecting Elle's privacy, is like in the election.
And that's of course the real problem, isn't it? Because by saying she's been arrested rather than she's been put in protective custody, which is actually, the sort of more technical way of looking at it. That's right. It looks like she, is just taking power into her own hands in terms of who she arrests and so on. I think that one of the things that really comes through is this idea that when there is poor communication, when things are done in secret, which somebody mentions, I can't remember who it is, somebody on the committee mentions, that things shouldn't be done in secret. And it's when that sort of thing happens that everything starts to fall apart. That might lead us on nicely then to sort of the final change in power, as it were, and the deeply unsatisfactory end to this season. But on the one hand, we have this sort of really important step, which is the one where they realise that they're running out of supplies, and they are going to have to find farmland. And Grizz, as our resident outdoor specialist, also interesting literary mind, also genuinely cute gay guy. I think that he has loads going for him. But off Grizz goes, and they do find this land. But while they are absent, we have this sort of seismic shift brought about by the various, I suppose, points of tension that have been reached, but also the opportunity given, because Ali says that she's been in charge for 5 months, and she now feels that if she's going to ask them to do more hard things, then it has to be as their elected leader. So what do you think of the sort of the election setup and Lexi and Harry.
So, well, I think it was interesting that Ali initially sort of was against calling this election, and that was as part of the discussion about where she initially rejected this
Mm.
sort of taking on of power, but then ended up wanting it more, or I guess
Yeah.
feeling like, no one else could really do the same job that she was doing after she was carrying the legacy that Cassandra had left behind.
Sometimes it starts off with like her not wanting it, and then you feel like she kind of wants the power, but then there is something within that isn't about the
Yeah.
power. It is literally about
No, I
the
don't really
fact that
think it is. Yeah, that she kind of feels like no one else can really do the job or has the
mm,
experience to do so. And I think she
mhm,
makes some good points. So Lexi is one of the people who kind of comes about and wants to run for.
mm,
There's four council positions and one mayor position.
mm,
And she sort of steps up after she feels like she experienced an injustice
mm.
by her treatment by the guard, and also well, during the Thanksgiving episode, she also performs a sort of political piece within an
Yeah,
improv.
she takes the improv in the direction of sort of satirizing
Yeah, I mean,
Ali.
which I was like, I think, people have a right to do that.
Mm.
But I also think, it was actually quite interesting to see her being like, oh, that's just the way that the improv went. And I was like, oh, but I don't know, you don't
Yeah,
have much
yeah, yeah.
relevance at all. But
It was largely in poor taste, wasn't it, as
yes, it
much
was
as
in poor
anything?
taste, I think,
Yeah.
rather than
Mm,
anything. But yeah, no, I think, but it should have been. I think people should have a right to express their unsatisfaction with the way that
mm,
things are being run. But yeah, so she sort of basically fans this fire of
mm,
frustration and unhappiness that people experience within the community, as we're discussing, due to sort of taking on all of this manual labor and having to share their spaces with other people and sort of losing out on a lot of the, I guess, privileges they had. And then, as you were saying, sort of the same thing that's going on here about the Tories and like
mm.
get the Tories out, but not
Yeah,
necessarily coming up with any policies themselves.
yeah. Because she very much sort of says, you can't vote for Harry because he's just interested in himself and his rich
Yes,
friends and getting his, access to his stuff back. And
yes.
then you can't vote for Ali for all the reasons you've just said. But
Yeah.
she doesn't posit any
But any sort of stance,
alternatives.
like yeah, no, she doesn't say what she stands for,
Yeah.
which is
But
kind of an issue in her argument as well. And it kind of turns out that she's also very easily manipulated when Campbell
mm,
comes along and wants to stage this sort of coup uprising against
mm,
Ali and against democracy. And Harry and Lexi become these sort of puppet leaders for
mm,
Campbell, I'd say. And also just sort of, yeah, I mean, and as well as the guards sort of involvement in that, it also really demonstrates how they have power due to their literal physique.
mhm.
And they talk about the dark ages and about how they're back
Yes.
in the dark ages, and that at the end of the day it's kind of whoever's the strongest and
Yeah.
most fit is
Yeah.
really going to be kind of on top for
Mm.
society.
And I think that when they're out on the expedition as well, they have a
Hmm.
conversation, don't they, about whether they'll, be reduced to eating each other. And Grizz is like,
Yeah,
no, chaos will break out before that.
well then.
We'll have all killed each other before we get around to like strategically eating one another.
Yeah, well, which I guess is also puts a lot of pressure on the expedition group to
It
find
does, and I have to
land.
say, I really sympathise when they're lying out in their fields having just
Yeah,
eaten
be
their
like,
trout or whatever and
yeah,
chased the turkeys, and they're just like, can't we just stay out here? I'm like, yes, yeah,
forever.
that's a great
Yeah, yeah.
plan.
No, exactly. I mean, yeah, I mean, exactly that. And it's sort of, I think Riz says he enjoys the quiet and the peace.
Mm,
But yeah, no, it's interesting to me, like what can be like gotten away with when, for example, Luke basically lies about what he overheard Ali and Will
yeah,
talking about and
yeah.
how quick everyone. I think there was that one character, gosh, what was her name? The girl who stands up at the end. He's like, I think you're
Gretchen?
lying. Gretchen, yeah, yeah, yeah. Big up Gretchen. Good for
Mm,
her. But she was like, I think you're lying, and
yeah.
that's sort of, yeah. Again, well, it's easy for me to sit here as the audience and sort of
Mm,
sort of say with, we're having seen this like dramatic irony, being like knowing what was going on behind the scenes, to be like,
Yeah.
obviously they're making this up, but it's a hard, I guess. And again, it's sort of Lexi being able to manipulate people's feelings to like support her movement is, I guess, very representative of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they take something very simple, the idea that they were somehow going to rig the election, for which there's,
Mhm.
no evidence one way or the other. It's all just hearsay.
Yeah. Well, and I guess again that's that thing of like they talk a lot about it's his word against mine, etc., etc. But
Mm,
then that sort of thing happens where it literally is Luke's word against
yeah,
hers.
absolutely.
Why
I,
is everyone?
and I think that, Luke is manipulated into it by this sort of peer pressure situation, isn't
Yeah.
he? And then he manages to manipulate Helena into believing him because of their like trying to save their relationship. There's a lot of weak characters there, which again I
Yeah.
think brings us back to this idea that Ali may not be a perfect leader in many ways, but there is definitely, I think we can agree that nobody else presents themselves really who could do a better
Yeah, it's
job.
competent, really. Yeah, I think I can't remember who says it, but it's something about I think it's something said to Lexi about, eventually when she wins the election, she has
Mm,
no plan. Like she's
mm,
gonna get strung up by the mob as like an
yeah.
incompetent spoon.
Mm.
Which
I
is
think it might be
exactly
Ali when they have their
is it?
meeting when Ali's just trying to, I can't remember, but there is a bit where Ali is basically saying to her, you need to know that this
Mm,
is, the situation, this is how much food we have.
yeah.
Um, And yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely a very strong sort of, feeling that we often, I suppose, you see with any electorate where people are like, we don't like the way things are, but they don't necessarily think what would happen if.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Or like, yeah,
we
an
do,
alternative to
we don't like Europe. We're going to vote for Brexit.
that.
Oh, we haven't got any European workers in our NHS. And this
Mm,
it's like those consequences haven't been thought through, and it's the same thing. We don't like litter everywhere, but we're not going to sweep it up. We don't
mm,
like it, people hoarding food, but we're not going to have a food rationing system.
no.
And I guess in a way, I
Mm,
felt that if Ali, obviously we see this idea, she's removed or whatever, she might actually be vindicated beyond the end of the sort of show as we see it, assuming that they're not actually going to execute her. I don't think that it's kind of going that direction. I think that all that's going to happen is that Lexi and Harry will be stuck with this situation where they have to live
yeah.
through a harsh winter. They have to farm the
Yeah.
land manually.
They have like none of the skill set to do so well. So I think, Ali has a very sort of strong court of
Mm. And also the
supporters.
people around her, it's
Yeah.
that as well, isn't it? Whereas it's going to cause sort of civil breakdown, I guess, a civil
Yeah.
war. When
Yeah.
Gordy is not telling Becca and Sam what's going on after they've had their baby, and they're just like, we don't know why
Mm.
nobody's sent us a congratulations message. It's like, oh, because the shit's hit the fan out there, but I'm not
Yeah.
going to tell you.
Literally, yeah.
So I suppose the one kind of thing that happens, behind all of that is that we've got Campbell behind the scenes,
Yeah.
somebody who nobody trusts, nobody would elect, and yet
Mm.
who is able to kind of manipulate those
Manipulate his way into
around
sort of
him.
power. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would have been very interesting to see where the story would have gone, but unfortunately, yeah.
No, well, as you were saying, if we're maybe going to get a graphic novel, or even if there's any sort of fanfic out there or whatever, I'm sure people have given some thought as to the direction it would go. But
Mm.
certainly, it does raise some really interesting questions about kind of what decisions perhaps a group of young people brought up with certain expectations then would, view about society. And this thing that Ali comes back to a number of times, which is basically, perhaps we were given this. Maybe they're there because of something their parents did.
Mm. Oh
Maybe it's
yeah.
not a punishment of them, it's a punishment of their parents, or maybe
Parents,
it's so
yeah.
that they
I
can
mean,
do better than their parents
yes.
did.
I mean, I think what we were talking about before, well, I was reading up a couple of theories online about
Mm,
how, so, towards the end, they work out that we forgot to mention that part of the plot was
mm.
in their town before they left, there was this
The
smell, which
smell, yeah,
the
that's one of the
smell,
most random
not
bits.
explained at all, but the smell remover, it's all a bit of a plot point. But yeah, basically they sort of, after digging around, they find out that that the parents, sort of mayor of this town, refused to pay the smell extractor to get rid of the smell, and that part of that was consequence was them basically being kidnapped to this alternate reality. And the guy, that I think there's some pictures that they sort of look at.
That's right. In the background, it's like crazy little guy
Yeah,
with
this
his
crazy little
cap.
guy in a hat, which is crazy. It took me that long to notice he was there, because even
Oh, but
I
he's just a bus driver. You see, nobody
bus
notices the
driver.
poor bus driver.
Yeah, no, he's this sort of character called Pfeiffer, who was apparently, he was in conversation with the leaders of this town about snow removal and stuff, and he takes a sort of like acts, the theory is he acts a revenge upon the town by taking their children away. And I was saying how many people on the internet sort of consider it a bit of a twist on the Pied Piper story.
I really like this. I hadn't come and
Yeah.
thought of this at all, but
Yeah, Pied
yeah,
Piper.
it's
Good
good.
phone
And
word.
certainly that idea of of stealing away the children or whatever
Yeah.
is a good fake tale metaphor, kind of given a bit of
Mm.
a twist here. Although, I think the idea that somebody would, steal your children into a parallel universe for a
It's a
$1.5
bit
million
crazy, just
contract, but
yeah, they're all like, call up the government, which you like, what's going?
there's
I think
something
that's
very
the
odd that,
supernatural
but
aspect of it. It's
yeah,
interesting.
and I think that one of the things that, definitely kind of comes out of all of this is that, yes, on the one hand, you've got all these people who are sort of saying, their lives have been taken away from them and things like that. They've been made to grow up so fast and so on. But there are actually characters who really, as it were, make the absolute most of the opportunities that are given to them. And we talk particularly about perhaps Gordy and Kelly.
Gordy and Kelly, yeah. I mean,
As I say, their sort of decision that, I think it's a couple of times they said we still have a library, we still have books, and that they're going to, train themselves as medics because that's what's necessary. And they're lucky in a way that it's a straightforward birth for
oh
Becca.
yeah, oh my gosh, the scene where the baby isn't breathing, I was like, oh my God, I was on the edge of my seat.
That's the second thing I've watched this week where a baby has been delivered and apparently isn't breathing.
Oh,
and the second time I was ready for it. I was like, come on, tap its feet. I know all about this now. Yeah, I mean, just generally that idea that, you can either sort of feel overwhelmed by a really bad situation, you can ignore it, or you can actually kind of like try and make the place better for other people.
Also, crazy experience they've got going on. Gordy and Kelly come back to the real world, be like, basically trained ourselves. She did like an IV first time.
She did, and again, I mean, and I thought that was quite nicely done because she basically like basically stabbing away in the arm until she does actually get the vein. Good veins, I thought. I apparently have good veins. Whenever I have blood taken, people I say, "Oh, you've got good veins." So I was admiring the veins and thinking, "Well, you're lucky." Otherwise, she'd have been stabbing away all over the place. But I think that it is something about basically saying this is a terrible situation, and of course, especially with sort of the medicine side of things, it could go horribly wrong, but it would go even worse if we don't do anything. And that I felt was, is quite indicative. And again, with Grizz leading his expedition, they're all going out there knowing that the last time they went out, maybe they weren't prepared, but somebody died, and he's got to sort of step up and sort of do. It's like, I suppose, it's like being in the military or something and doing sort of these dangerous and unpleasant tasks because they're required of you. And it's those who are self-centered and those who are perhaps quite stupid or think, oh, I could do better than, rather than, I'm going to educate myself or whatever, that don't come across so well. That said, of course, at the end of the 10 weeks, we've got a psychopath running a puppet government, mainly sort of following a military coup. And the only positive is that they found a field with some turkeys in it. So who knows? But yeah, I think The reason I like this show is definitely
Mm.
because, yeah, okay, it's weird, but there's also something about the sort of the constant what would you do sort of
Yeah.
situation that plays out in this sort of like really weird scenario. But actually, it's exactly the same as the sort of, what are the things that matter to you with regards to, I don't know, property law or
Mm.
food equality or the ideas of people's role in government and those sorts of things. You can play that out. While, as you say, there's also the sort of slight kind of mystery of smell slash bus
Mm.
slash weird solar eclipse and
Yes.
so on.
What's going on?
Did you have any takeaways from them?
Ooh, for me, I guess it was sort of, I guess it's a bit of a commentary about like not necessarily the human condition, but a bit about like what people prioritize and sort of the lengths that they'll go to despite their
Yeah.
sort of situation. And well, I don't know, like I guess as someone who I consider myself like very left orientating sort of like political stance,
Mm.
but I don't know how accurate the idea that sort of these teenagers don't necessarily have the foresight to see that, oh, probably rationing and, you
Mm.
know, sort of sharing housing and putting in communal work is for the greater good. I think there's a lot that talks about what we owe to each other and the
Mm.
sort of, especially now, there's the sort of, I don't know, owe anyone anything
Mm.
mentality at the moment. But
Yeah.
in this situation, I guess, people do owe each other
Mm.
a lot. And I don't know, maybe sort of taking that as a takeaway message and sort of what
Yeah.
we achieved as a collective, even though, it sort of starts going a bit wrong in the end. But yeah, and
But the very fact that we're left thinking it's going wrong makes us think it would be better if,
if,
doesn't
yeah,
it? And
exactly.
yeah, I guess it's put in a harsh microcosm, isn't it? When the things that need to be done are basically cleaning and cooking and
Mm,
work, manual work, and things like that. But I guess it also tells us some of the limitations of what has actually happened with historical communism, for example,
mm,
and the authoritarian leaders. And again, the power of the police as a little bit of a sort of potential reflection on that.
mm,
And also something I think about the disadvantages of like a planned economy and basically saying, this person needs to do this job and this person needs to do this job rather than sort of relying on kind of market forces. But in this situation in which they're in, I'm not sure that there's another solution to that. But it does, of course, create dissatisfaction. So I suppose if we were to take this to something bigger, then it would raise other questions about what workers will and won't do.
yeah.
But as you say, in the circumstances, it does give us a good message about kind of acting for the greater good and not
Mm.
not being a Harry, essentially. So yeah. Okay, well, we will be back in 2 weeks' time with, what did we say? Oh yes, A Clockwork Orange. Um, so we'll see you at the beginning of February for that. In the meantime, please do follow Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs on Instagram, where you will find links to our website, book recommendations, updates about other things that we are doing, and also the links to our sister project, beingsociety.com. If you'd like to make a donation to cover our costs and keep us free from the horrible world of corporate advertising, then you'll also find our coffee link there. Be much appreciated. Woo. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.